To set the tone, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college and quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town but full of not decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings in broad daylight, robberies, you name it. Well, for the first 3 years I lived with roommates on the side of town that wasn't awful, but it was sketchy. So when I was making decent enough money, I moved out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet if that. Super old and poorly built. It was just me living there, so I didn't mind how small it was. But what originally sold me was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and some wooded areas, with only a few houses nearby. Considering I hated being in the town due to the continuous paranoia of getting mugged or shot, I loved the idea of living out there. So at the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell minus not being able to get good internet. A month goes by and everything is still swell to me, and I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent long amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. Important later. Roughly 2 months into living there and I start to notice things out of place. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as storage space until he got moved in himself. So he had a key, but was never there. He kinda just popped in once every other week to grab something and usually let me know beforehand. But I'd come home to my kitchen chair being pulled away from my table, or a bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small things I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by, or just stuff I was forgetting. But then my dog developed this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He'd just lay on the couch and chew his toys. He never barked, never did anything weird. However, all of a sudden he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He'd literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and wouldn't stop until I came back in the house. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him yet, so I decided one day I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task up at work and knew I'd be home early, so I put in a copy of Hamlet. I know, boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long. I knew it would be playing when I came back. Flash forward 3 hours, long before Hamlet should have been over. But when I walked in the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and the Xbox were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him, and he shrugged it off as the TV powering off when it idles for a while. Even though this is true, there are several reasons I know this isn't the case. 1, it wasn't idling. A 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. 2, even if it had shut off, my Xbox wouldn't have. I have left it on by accident for weeks when I was gone out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home. Always. But it was completely powered down this time. The weird thing is, none of my stuff was missing, and the door was locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself that it was something weird with the Xbox, or whatever, and shrugged it off. This is until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier when I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she even walked by the house while he was out, he'd start yelping and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me and made me incredibly cautious of her. I put some cheap alarms on my door, the kind that go off when the door is open, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night the alarms were on my door, I was woke up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. But once I got to the door, it was shut, and there was nobody there. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room. The door would have had to open for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and landed there. Something else weird. The door was locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my locks after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do much as I had no witnesses, no lead, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the locks. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that, but later found out that the close neighbor that my dog hated had previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I have no way to prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. Why though? I can't figure out. Nothing of mine ever went missing. The most unsettling part for me though, is that she had tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times had she been in my house at night while I was asleep? And why? For my daughter's 10th birthday, I got her a big vat of modeling clay. At first, it was a big success. I mean, why wouldn't it be? What kind of child doesn't love messing around with Play-Doh, right? Modeling clay was just the natural progression from that, a step up. It was an innocent idea, but as you will soon come to understand, I wish more than anything that I would have just bought her a dollhouse instead. Lily was one of the most artistic and creative people I ever met, despite her young age. I would always find her sitting in her room, painting or drawing on a piece of paper, or maybe acting out a scene from one of her favorite TV shows, assisted by various stuffed animals. One time, I walked in to find her working on a crude illustration of a pink unicorn. The day after that, I laid my eyes upon a beautiful castle accompanied by a charming stick woman princess. Sometimes her drawings would even transcend beyond the paper and find themselves on various furniture and walls around the house. As a supportive parent, I felt it was important to encourage this kind of behavior and help further develop her artistic expressions as best I could. Whenever I looked back to my childhood years, I find many fond memories of sculpting various figures and characters out of modeling clay. Whether it be for art and crafts projects, or just for recreational use, I found their creative possibilities to be endless. It was like playing God in a sense. I used to be pretty good at it as well. I was able to transform concepts and characters that only existed in my mind into tangible, real-life objects that I could see and touch. The happiness it brought me back then was indescribable. I wanted my daughter to experience a similar joy to the one I had, to let her express herself through yet another artistic medium. I thought it would be a perfect gift for her upcoming birthday, and hopefully it would serve as a distraction from what was currently going on with her mom. When the idea popped into my head, I immediately went over to my elderly neighbor Gray to ask if I could buy some modeling clay from him. He and his wife had been living across the street ever since we bought our house, over a decade ago, and we had quickly got acquainted. Before he retired, he used to teach pottery lessons at the local community center in town. He was an extremely skilled potter and had a gentle and kind aura surrounding him. He was a very beloved figure in our neighborhood and would always go out of his way to help out members of the community. In a way, he was kind of like our own version of Bob Ross. I figured that since he had been retired for quite some time now, he might have some leftover clay that he would be willing to sell me for a fairly reasonable price. But when I went over to his house, a wave of sorrow washed over me as his wife, now a widow, answered the door with wary eyes. Upon hearing the tragic news, I offered my condolences, and she invited me inside. I explained to her why I came over, and she happily led me to Gray's workshop in the attic. The place was exactly like you would imagine it. Terracotta pots and various other ceramic artifacts lay scattered everywhere. On his desk were several of those spinning pottery wheels where you would spin the clay around on. His shelves were littered with all kinds of materials one would use for such a craft. And the icing on the cake, the smell. It smelled like fresh, wet dirt with hints of iron in it. You know the one. Greg's wife, Isabel, was happy to part with some of the stuff that for so long had cluttered her attic. so she let me leave with a big vat of modeling clay that sat patiently waiting by his workbench. She said it was the clay Greg had been working with before his sudden passing, and that it was some kind of rare high-quality mixture from South America. In other words, state-of-the-art and extremely expensive. Immensely grateful, I thanked her for her kindness and offered to lend a helping hand if she ever needed one. A few days later, a quizzical grimace formed on my daughter's face as she unboxed her new birthday present. "What is it?" she asked, inspecting the package. I didn't blame her for not understanding right away. The gray plastic barrel didn't exactly present itself as some kind of toy a 10-year-old would receive as a gift. "It's modeling clay, honey," I told her. My wife shot me a look from across the room. I hadn't informed her of the gift beforehand. "For your art projects, you can make anything you want." Lily looked over to her mom, who sat on the couch with a glass of wine, before rising to her feet and attempting to pry the plastic lid open. I walked over to my wife, Evelyn. I could tell that she wasn't too happy about her daughter's latest gift. "You'll be the one having to clean it up," she teased. "You know how much of a mess this is gonna make?" I reassured her and reached out for her hand. A loud pop sounding through the living room as the lid flew open and Lily grabbed the handful of clay and started toying with it. If only if I had known then what she had just unleashed. Over the course of the next few weeks, Lily got really into sculpting. What first started as mostly abstract shapes and vaguely humanoid blobs eventually turned into well-defined and surprisingly detailed sculptures. And the special qualities of the clay made it really easy for her to use and disassemble as she wished. It hardened after only a couple of hours, and if she wanted to reshape it, all it took was a few drops of water to restore its malleable properties. I watched as she made various clay figurines, including a sculpture of one of the unicorns from her paintings, a couple of clay houses, and an elephant, among other things. But those aren't the focus of this story. No. If that were the case, there probably wouldn't even be a story to tell. The whole thing started when she made that thing, that wretched abomination she called Claymate. I never understood why she grew so fond of it. It was hideous. She was way too talented of an artist to waste her skills and time on something so awful looking. The first time I met Claymate was on a Sunday morning at the dinner table. My wife and I sat down to eat breakfast when Lily walked into the kitchen carrying something on her shoulder. She pulled out 2 chairs from under the table and got seated, one for herself, the other for Claymate. Evelyn and I looked at each other upon the sight of Claymate. We initially wanted to laugh, as it looked hysterically despicable, but we managed to compose ourselves for our daughter's sake. It was the first time I had seen my wife smile in what felt like forever. "Who's this, honey?" Evelyn asked. "Claymate," Lily responded, reaching over to pour herself a glass of milk, as if there was nothing abnormal about the situation. My wife gazed over to me and shot me a look that said, "Why couldn't you just have gotten her a Barbie doll?" Claymate was a person-shaped blob of clay with vaguely human facial features, 2 pinched-in holes for eyes, a slimy carved smile. It had no hair, no clothes, or any other identifiable details. Just a crude humanoid clay person with an awful grin. It was about half the height of my daughter. "And what is he? Where is he from?" I asked, trying to show interest in her hobby. "Oh, he's not from around here. He's just visiting. He says he wants to make new friends." I looked over to Claymate, intently inspecting the lifeless expression that contoured across his face. There was just something about his stone-cold eyes that almost gave me the creeps. I know it's silly to be unnerved by a 10-year-old's arts and craft project, but there was something eerie about it that I couldn't quite place my finger on. Honestly, it made me even regret buying the modeling clay in the first place. "That's great, Lily," Evelyn said. "I hope you give him the warm welcome he deserves." Later that day, we had to leave Lily home alone for the evening as I drove my wife to the hospital. She had recently been diagnosed with an extremely rare illness called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I'm no doctor, so I can't really go into all the medical details surrounding the disease, nor do I see any point in doing so. All you need to know is that it's a fatal condition that causes brain damage which rapidly worsens over time, nor any effective treatment other than painkillers, antidepressants, and sedatives, which only serve to make the patient's remaining days as comfortable as possible. It was absolutely heartbreaking. As you can imagine, Evelyn didn't take the news too well, and neither did I. I was about to lose the love of my life at the young age of 38. It felt like we had gotten robbed. Our future was stolen by forces beyond our control. We hadn't told Lily yet, but I suspected she already knew something was wrong. Later that evening, we returned home from the hospital to be met with Lily sitting on the living room couch, watching cartoons on the TV. Beside her sat Claymate, motionless. At first, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, until I stepped on something soft and squishy. I looked down to see what it was. Wet clay. Then I looked up and noticed a pair of muddy footprints trailing from Claymate on the couch and out into the kitchen. "What's all this, Lily?" I asked her and pointed at the mess she made. "It's just Claymate. His feet do that when he walks around," she responded. "I know it's a little messy, but I promise to clean it up later." I tried to suppress the growing frustration within me. The last thing I wanted to do after a long day at the hospital with my terminally ill wife was to come home to a muddy mess of a home. "Well, next time, just carry him," Evelyn said, also with a hint of frustration in her voice. For some reason, I couldn't sleep that night. I laid awake in bed, tossing and turning. Was it too hot in here, or was the stress finally getting to me? I looked over at my nightstand. Bright red fluorescent lights displayed 2:03 a.m. Jesus, had it been 3 hours already? I was due to wake up in only 5. My wife was snoring, per usual. Maybe I just needed a glass of water. I got out of bed and quietly made my way downstairs towards the kitchen. I didn't bother turning on the ceiling lights, as I didn't want to ruin my tiredness even further. The streetlights outside shone in through the window anyway, providing just enough light to partially illuminate the house interior. I poured myself a glass of water, and then a glass of milk, because I had heard somewhere that milk makes you sleepy. I didn't know if that was true or not, but I didn't care at that point. A heavy shuffling sound behind me caught me off guard, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I quietly put the glass on the kitchen counter and turned around. It was coming from the living room. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone was scuffling around. I slowly made my way towards the source of the sound, struggling to keep my breathing as still as possible. And then a loud thud sounded as if something had fallen to the floor. I turned the corner and saw nothing. Nobody was there. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I walked to the center of the room to further investigate when I noticed something rectangular on the ground. I picked it up and held it in front of the large living room window to let the lamps outside shed light on whatever it was I was holding. A family photo, taken years prior at some kind of amusement park. I can't even remember where we were that day, but we looked so happy, without a care in the world. Evelyn looked so young, so beautiful. I reminisced for a while, before placing it back on the shelf it had fallen off. I stepped back and froze. My primal instincts had taken over. My conscious mind hadn't even registered it yet. I felt a crippling amount of dread overcome my entire body. The kind of dread you feel deep in your chest. I felt like a deer in headlights, frozen, not knowing what to do. Then, I noticed it. The shadow in the corner of the room, standing right by the staircase. A humanoid silhouette. Standing just 4 feet tall. Oh, I rationalized. It was just Lily. A wave of relief washed over me, and I chuckled to myself. You gave me quite a scare there. I laughed, trying to shake off the fact that I let a 10-year-old girl make me quiver in fear. What are you doing up this late? It's way past your... Before I could finish the sentence, Lily's shadowy figure hurried up the stairs at what seemed to be an inhuman speed. Hey, relax. You're not gonna get in trouble," I whispered as loud as I could before I ran after her. But just before I got to the bottom of the staircase, I slipped on something. I landed flat on my back, groaning. After a speedy recovery, I got back up and immediately realized what I had slipped on. Wet clay. But it was impossible. We had cleaned it all up before we went to sleep. I was sure of it. It certainly hadn't been there when we went to bed, and it most certainly hadn't been there before I went down for a glass of water either. This had to be fresh, I reasoned. I followed a trail of small traces of mud up the stairs, and then followed the trail throughout the hallway, around the corner, past the bathroom, and finally into Lily's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, so I quietly pushed it open. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, except for the muddy floor. Lily was sound asleep in her bed, or at least pretending to be. I walked over and checked on her. Every parent knows that kids pretending to sleep behave very differently from kids that actually are asleep. You can tell by the small erratic spasms and the breathing, body language and snoring. But by all accounts, Lily wasn't pretending. She really was asleep. I leaned in and put my ear to her head to check again. Sound asleep, no signs of faking it. I contemplated waking her up and asking her about what I had just witnessed, but I decided against it. I could wait till morning. As I turned around to leave, I saw it. Claymate, sitting on a stool in the corner, observing me, its blank expressionless eyes devoid of life, staring back at me as I exited the room. That thing gave me the creeps. The next morning I asked Lily about what happened, but you guessed it, she feigned ignorance. She was probably scared she was gonna get into trouble. Had she found out about her mom? Would that explain the family photo? Maybe this was her way of dealing with it. I wish she'd just told me. Over the following weeks, Evelyn's condition worsened. Visits to and from the hospital became too regular. We would have to tell Lily sooner or later, so that's exactly what we did. We told her everything. Understandably, she did not take it very well. She ran to her room, crying and throwing a fit. Of course, I didn't blame her. I walked up to her bedroom door and put my hand on the knob, contemplating opening it. I stood there for a moment, listening to her cry. I didn't know how long I stood there, but eventually her crying started to sound different. She wasn't crying anymore. She was talking. I calmly opened the door to find her sitting on the floor, talking to a large mass of clay that had seemingly melted into the floor. What remained of Claymate's head was partially melted into a puddle. It seemed that in her rage, Lily had completely dismantled the poor thing. Good riddance, I thought. The morning after, I was horrified to see Claymate 2.0 sitting at the dining table, ready for breakfast. This iteration of the abomination looked way more detailed. It was much bigger and had way more defined facial features. It nearly crossed over into the uncanny valley. It looked like a regular boy, made out of clay of course, much less of an eyesore, but it still infuriated me for some reason. "Does he have to sit at the table with us, sweetie?" I asked Lily, grinning my teeth. "You're getting mud all over the tablecloth." My wife looked at me but refrained from saying anything. "He's part of the family, Dad. He has every right to sit here," Lily responded. For some reason, I had decided that I hated Claymate. There was just something about him that absolutely infuriated me now, and I didn't know why. I know it's silly and maybe a bit hypocritical considering I bought her the damn thing, but still, I grew to hate him. "Just remove him, please," I blurted out. "He just wants to be loved too," she shouted. "That's all he wants. Why can't he be part of the family as well? I want him gone from the dining room." I raised my voice. Lily grabbed Claymate and hurried off towards her room. I tried following her, but Evelyn stopped me, a tear running down her cheek. That day weighed heavy on both Lily and me, but I cannot even begin to fathom how my wife had felt when she received the news. Due to her severely deteriorated condition, she would have to make an overnight stay at the hospital. I brought Lily with me this time, her first time actually. She didn't want to leave her mother's side, even when the clock ticked past midnight. To be honest, I didn't want to leave either, but my wife insisted I get Lily home and ready for school the following day. Heavy drops of rain splattered across the hood of the taxi as we exited the vehicle. The overhead street lamps lit up the path as I carried Lily over my shoulder across our driveway. I felt commotion on my shoulder and looked over to Lily. As she was being carried, she attempted to wave her hand. "Why are you waving?" I asked her. "To say hello," she bluntly answered. "Say hello to who?" Her wave transformed into a pointing gesture. I looked up to the second-story window, the window to Lily's bedroom. I strained my eyes. Through the thick downpour, it was hard to make out anything. Ready to just forget about it, I was about to look away when the headlights of the taxi behind me turned to briefly illuminate her room. There was someone standing by the window. A black silhouette held up its hand as if to wave back. It stood there motionless, lit up by the powerful beams of the car. The taxi then swerved around and spewed off, allowing her room to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness once more. I came to a halt right in front of our front door. Someone was inside my house. I had seen it only for a brief moment, but I was sure of it. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stay out in the rain either. Not with Lily. I quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside. I put Lily down and reached for the light switch. With the presence of light, a horrifying sight presented itself. There were muddy footprints everywhere, and I mean everywhere. They ran across the floor, into the kitchen, into the living room, up the walls, and even along the ceiling. And they weren't boot prints either. No. The culprit appeared to be barefoot. 5 distinctive toes accompanied each footprint. But what was most off-putting was the size of the prints. They looked like they belonged to a child, close to Lily's size actually. A chill ran down my spine upon realizing who they belonged to. No, it couldn't be, I thought to myself as I rushed up the stairs and burst open the door to Lily's bedroom. There, standing by the window, was Claymate. The eerily boy-looking clay sculpture stood as still as a statue. Both of its arms hung down by its side. Soulless eye holes blankly stared back at me. It was like I was gazing into the abyss. It was clear who the footprints belonged to. The trail led here. Claymate remained motionless as I picked it up and angrily walked downstairs with it. "What are you doing?" Lily cried. I paid her no attention as I opened the back door of the house and threw it as far as I could out into our garden. Lily tried running past me to save Claymate, but I held her back. "No, you're done. You can't play with him anymore," I firmly told her. I watched as the rain hammered down on Claymate, burning through him as if it were acid. He started melting. His face contorted into a horrible grimace as the rain dissolved Claymate's horrible visage. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I brought Lily back inside and put her to bed. It was way past her bedtime, and way past mine as well. She was furious, and we fought hard before she finally fell asleep. I decided I would clean up the house the following morning. Before laying down in my bed, I glanced out the window overlooking our garden. Claymate, or what remained of him, was completely gone. Good, I thought, as I laid down and closed my eyes. The following days were actually pretty normal. Evelyn was still admitted to the hospital, but she seemed to be in a sound enough condition. I visited her every day, and even brought her flowers on one occasion. Lily was doing well in school, despite her terrible sorrow for her mother. I started working longer shifts so that I could be better able to provide for my family during these straining times. It was just a matter of time before I would get a call from the hospital. It was inevitable. I started preparing for the worst. Luckily, Lily didn't seem to mind spending most of her days home alone. She had grown to be quite independent, although she seemed quieter than usual. It was clear that the stress of losing her mother had a great impact on her psyche than I initially thought. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I had just gotten home from work when laughter and giggling filled my ears as I stepped through the doorway. A familiar voice echoed through the house. I was in disbelief. I followed the sound to its source and fell down to my knees. There, sitting on the couch, together with Lily, was Evelyn, my terminally ill wife. Evelyn, only she looked better than she had done in years, like her illness had been cured overnight. She looked energized, warm, and welcoming, as beautiful as the day I first met her. I tried to speak, but was unable to let out even a single word. How? What? I finally mustered up. Evelyn looked at me and smiled. I hadn't seen that smile in what felt like ages. Her perfectly white teeth and pink voluptuous lips radiated warmth. "Isn't it wonderful, Daddy?" Lily excitedly yelled. "Mommy's back! She's well again! But they said," was all I could let out before my phone started ringing. Evelyn stood up from the couch and walked over to me. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. "It's the hospital, honey. Might want to take it," I said to her as she reached out her arms and put them around me. Evelyn was so soft. I raised the phone to my ear and answered. "Good afternoon, sir. This is Dr. Elliot speaking, calling from Eastmark General Hospital." The man on the phone introduced himself. Evelyn's hands caressed the back of my neck. "It's about your wife, sir. You might want to sit down for this." Dr. Elliot continued. "Oh, I know, Doc," I replied in excitement. "I'm standing right here with her. She looks so..." "Excuse me? No, I'm not sure you understand, sir. I'm sorry." The doctor interrupted. The smile slowly faded from my face and formed into an expression of confusion. Evelyn pressed herself up against my back and held me tight. "What do you mean?" I asked him. "Your wife, sir. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but she passed peacefully in her sleep 15 minutes ago," Dr. Elliot informed me. I dropped my phone and froze. That was impossible. It couldn't be. Was this some sort of sick joke? A prank call? It felt as if time stood still. Evelyn squeezed me tight. No, it couldn't have been a prank call. It was the hospital's phone number, and Dr. Elliot was my wife's assigned doctor. None besides us could have known that. But she was standing right here. I didn't understand. I put my arms around her instinctually. She was so soft and so smooth, but something was wrong. She was too soft, and she was cold to the touch. I squeezed a little harder and felt my fingers dig into her flesh, leaving behind multiple indentations. I looked at her face. "But you're right here," I said to her. I noticed Lily on the couch. She looked confused as well, worried. Evelyn stared back blankly at me. A familiar sense of dread had manifested itself deep within me. She wasn't Evelyn. I pushed her away, struggling to get her arms off me. I reached out and brushed my hand against her face. A sandy white powder stained my hand. It looked to be some kind of makeup. I glanced up at the spot I had just touched on Evelyn's face and saw what lay underneath the carefully constructed facade. I felt 1,000 knives stab my heart simultaneously as I realized what I was looking at. It was Clay. No, it wasn't Evelyn at all. It was Claymate. I shouted angrily at the top of my lungs. I shouted at the insult to my wife's legacy that stood in front of me. It filled me with anger. Whatever this thing was, I fully intended to destroy it. I threw a punch at the imposter and recoiled in pain. It was like punching a brick wall. I clutched my bruised hand and took a step back. Claymate looked to Lily and tried forming some sort of expression across its face. My wife's face. Whether it was one of sorrow or of anger, I could not tell. I'm not sure Lily even understood what that thing was. In a stiff and jagged motion, Claymate ran out the back door and out into the garden. It looked like a toddler who had just learned to walk. "Mommy, wait!" Lily shouted and ran after it. I tried stopping her, reaching out to hold her back, but it was too late. Lily was gone. I snapped out of my horror-stricken daze and ran after her. It was dark out. If she had run past the light fixtures of the garden and out into the adjacent woods, there was no way I would be able to find her. I ran out the door and stopped. In the middle of the lawn, Claymate sat bent down on its knees. In front of it stood Lily. Evelyn's face started molding, and she had quickly become unrecognizable. Her limbs began swelling, and it almost seemed like her skin was bubbling. Claymate's entire body started shifting. It grew larger. It burst out of the clothes it was wearing, my wife's clothes. It had returned to its base form, a muddy and crude sculpture of a boy, except it was larger than before. It was roughly the same size as me. It moved its grotesque sandy mouth and looked as if it was trying to form a vocalization. A series of unnerving gasps and exhales escaped its malleable maw before they started to sound intelligible. Lily. A deep, growling voice spoke. It sounded like a dog or a parrot trying to mimic human language. It was incredibly off-putting. Lily. It said again, placing its muddy hand on her shoulder and molding its face into a happy expression. Its features reminded me of a theater mask. Lily screamed in terror and started wailing. I wanted to help, but I felt powerless to do so, paralyzed with fear. I watched as Lily turned her back to it and attempted to make her escape. She locked eyes with me before she was yanked back. The thing had stretched one of its arms to a monstrous proportion and used it as a tendril, wrapping itself around Lily and pulling her back towards itself. "Let me go!" she screamed, begging me to help her. I ran towards the monster, attempting to pry her free from the stone-hard terracotta grip, but it used its other arm to toss me back. I slammed into one of the exterior walls of the house and landed on my back. Wet mud stained my clothes as I rose to my feet and charged the clay monster again. Same result. Claymate started transforming, its form even more contorted and unnatural. Had it been in any other setting, its appearance would have been almost comical. I saw Lily struggling to break free from the creature's grasp, and there was nothing I could do. I couldn't get close enough to her. I witnessed in terror as Claymate wrapped itself around her, engulfing her inside a mass of muddy clay. She was trapped inside it. I could see her arms and legs protruding out of the clay, struggling, fighting. She was going to suffocate, and there was nothing I could do. I once again attempted to run towards it. My fatherly instincts overcame me, and I felt adrenaline power up my body. I clawed and punched the monster as best I could, attempting to dig her out. But for each piece of clay I removed, another would take its place. It was in vain, but I had to try. I continued digging. Listening to Lily's muffled screams from inside Claymate only fueled my aggression. I looked back at the house, scanning the ground for anything I could use. A shovel, a big stick, knives, anything. I was desperate. Lily's screams faded, and her protruding limbs suddenly went limp. That's when I noticed it. The garden hose curled up like a snake in the corner of our lawn. I remember how the rain had dissolved Claymate previously, how the water flowed through the being like a winding river. I rushed towards it, fumbling it with shaking hands as I picked it up and aimed it at the big ball of clay that had swallowed my daughter. I tasted a combination of salt and iron on my lips as tears ran down my cheeks. I was so tired, but I had to try. I turned the release valve on the hose and felt the hose go taut as the water shot through it. I aimed a concentrated beam of high-pressured water directly at the monstrosity occupying my lawn. As soon as the water made contact with the beast, it bellowed in what I could only discern as pain. I relentlessly continued blasting it with water, moving closer and closer. I could see Claymate's gasping face slowly start to melt. A previously rigid and hard body had turned soft and squishy. Wet brown mud spewed in all directions. Slowly but surely, more and more Lily's body came into view. The creature attempted to flee, making its escape towards the tree line. Lily laid in the middle of the garden, covered in dirt and wet sand, but free from Claymate's hostage. Suddenly, silence filled the air. Claymate was nowhere to be seen, except for the muddy trail left behind. It had disappeared into the woods, hopefully for good this time. I turned off the hose and tossed it aside. I ran towards Lily and quickly picked her up and brought her inside the house. Before locking the door behind us, I turned around and gazed into the dark forest just a couple feet away from the lawn. Nothing. No signs of our sentimental assailant. I closed the door and called 911. Lily survived. Paramedics were able to resuscitate her, or whatever they did to save her life. I wouldn't know, because I apparently collapsed from exhaustion shortly after they arrived on our doorstep. I'm not sure how this event will affect Lily going forward. I can't imagine how traumatizing she must be. And to top it off, with the death of her mother, I'm afraid it will just be too much for her. I have taken a leave from work in order to get things sorted out. I needed a mental break after everything I experienced during these past couple of weeks. Life seems to have returned to normal, at least as normal as life could be after this. Lily hasn't shown any signs of trauma, and she still continues to pursue her artistic hobbies, though it will be hard to say whether these events will have a greater impact in the future. As for Claymate, I don't fully believe he, or it, or whatever you want to call it, is gone. I didn't feel like I killed it that night, only injured it. This was only a minor setback. It needs time to regrow. I don't know what it wants, or what it intended to do with Lily that fateful night. Whatever its plans are, I'm certain they are sinister in nature. This morning, while fetching today's newspaper on the driveway, I glanced over to Isabel and her late husband's Greg's house across the street. I now know how she feels every day being a widow, how empty her house must feel without him by her side anymore. I was lucky to still have Lily at least. Isabel had none. No kids, no grandkids, and I was pretty sure most of her friends weren't around anymore. I thought about paying her a visit sometime, when I suddenly noticed movement coming from the attic window of the house. I rubbed my groggy eyes and focused. Up there, standing by the window, stood a man, an old and disheveled man. It took some time before I connected the dots, but when I finally recognized him, my heart sank. Goosebumps covered my body. It was Greg. Greg stood there, staring blankly at me. An all too familiar expression stretched across his face. He slowly raised a hand and placed his palm on the glass. Greg stared at me for a moment and grinned, before retrieving his hand and slowly retreating back into the attic. Before I knew it, he was out of view, gone, vanished. The only trace that remained of him was the muddy handprint he left stained on the window. So I think I should start by telling you all that I'm just a normal guy in a dead-end job and no real friends or family to brag about. But my whole life changed a year ago, and this is what happened. It was a normal Friday evening, and I was on my way home from work when I came across some roadworks that meant I had to follow a diversion round. It was pretty dark as I was following the road. I got a flat tire, which was exactly what I wanted after a stressful week at work. I got out of the car and started changing my tire when I caught a glint of something shiny in the light from my iPhone. I went and looked and saw a single key, so me being me, I picked it up and put it in my pocket. The rest of that evening was uneventful as I changed my tire and made my way home. The next morning I got up just before midday, made my coffee and sat at my table. Then I remembered the key. I grabbed it to take a better look and see if I could find anything that would help me locate the owner. When I took a better look, I could see it was a very old-looking key with no real identifying marks, so set it on the table while finishing my coffee. Later that afternoon, I grabbed the key and purely out of boredom had put it in the lock of my basement door and turned it. To my surprise, I heard the locking mechanisms engage, so went to open the door to see if it really had unlocked the door. As I opened the door, I stood there in utter shock and amazement. On the other side of the door was a vast landscape, not unlike the city I lived in, yet with subtle differences here and there. I wish I could tell you I shut the door and didn't think of it anymore. But come on, what person in their right mind wouldn't want to see what in the world was going on? So I let my curiosity win, and I stepped through the door grabbing the key as I closed it behind me. This city was beautiful and huge and so familiar, so I stopped someone and asked them where I am, which got me a weird look and a brush off, which afterwards I realized was because a sane person wouldn't ask where they were. I found a newspaper stand and grabbed a local paper and was shocked to see I was in my own city. Yet it couldn't be, as there was stuff that didn't make sense, like shops that I had never heard of or buildings that I had never noticed before. Before I would start panicking, I thought to myself, if this was my city, then I could make my way home as I have done thousands of times from the city. I have to say that it took me longer than I would have liked to find my way home. But when you see roads that don't exist or signs that make no sense whatsoever, you have to go on instinct. That aside, when I finally got to my house, I realized I didn't have my door keys on me, as in my stupidity, because I went through the basement door. My brain decided they were not needed. Now, luckily for me, I got on really well with my neighbor, and we actually have a spare set of each other's keys in case of emergencies. I knocked on my neighbor's door, and a stranger answered. So I told them who I was, and if I could speak to the owner of the house, as I had locked myself outside. This person looked me up and down and said if I don't leave, they will call the police. I tried to explain to them the situation again, but they shouted something that made no sense. I've lived here for 30 years alone, and the owner of the house next door is an old man who looks nothing like you. So go, or the police will be called. I decided I was either going crazy or something wasn't right about where I was. I then remembered the key and thought, why don't I just go back to that door in the city and go through that back to my home? So I decided to make my way back to the city, and what felt like forever, I finally found the door I came through. I put the key in the lock, and before I turned it, I noticed something that knocked me clear off my feet in shock. I caught a glimpse of a TV in a shop window of the president giving a speech, but this wasn't the president I knew. This wasn't even a politician I recognized. This made no sense, but I wanted to go home, so I turned the key and ran through the door and slammed it shut. I took a deep breath then, looked into the room properly when I dropped my keys in disbelief. This wasn't my house. I was now in some store with people staring at me as I brushed away a tear from my face. A nice woman came up to me and asked if I was okay, which I said I was fine, just felt a bit under the weather. I got up and asked her if I could use the bathroom, to which she happily agreed. While in the bathroom, I used the key on the door again and looked through, and to my utter amazement, I saw a vast landscape where the rest of the store should have been. I closed the door and took the key out to get a proper look at it, but just as before, it looked like a normal old key. I put it back in the lock and opened the door again to help get my head around what I saw, but noticed this time there was a living room on the other side. I closed the door again and reopened it, and to my amazement, a completely different landscape once again. It then hit me that each time the door opened, it was somewhere new. So I opened it one more time and walked through, not knowing that this time I wasn't alone. This time I was in a busy shopping mall, so I decided to walk around and try to make sense of what was happening, when I was grabbed and dragged into an empty room by something. I was screaming for help and slowly came to realize that this room had no doors and one big mirror. I was sweating and trying to rack my brain for a logical answer, when suddenly a man dressed in a black suit said to me, "It's not often we come across your kind messing with these things they don't understand, but I will make this as clear as possible. You will not leave this room alive before telling me everything you know about that key." I felt a wave of fear envelop me as I looked at him. It was then I realized he wasn't a man or even human, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. You see, it was the same shape as a man and was wearing that suit, but its face was all fuzzy and not the fun kind. Have you ever had your TV on a channel not picking up a signal and you get that weird black and white static? Well, that's the best I can describe its face, because whatever it was, my brain clearly couldn't comprehend. While in the room with this thing, I tried my best to answer any question it posed to me, all the while trying to figure a way out of this hell. One question I do remember, as I found it odd, yet strangely informative, was, From what we can tell, you originated from dimension Zeta 456 and somehow have ended up in dimension Omega 249. How have you managed to cross dimensional borders without prior authorization? It then hit me in that question that this creature has no idea about the key, so I started to answer as best I could while casually feeling the outside of my pocket. I was in shock the key was still there. In fact, everything was still in my pockets, including my very phone on which I'm writing this. I tried to not show my excitement as I answered more questions. That was until it grabbed me and started stabbing me with what I only can describe as some sort of knife. But unlike a normal knife, this thing had lights and a display. The creature managed to stab me 3 times all along my left arm before I grabbed the weird knife thing, ran towards the window and thrusted the blade into the bottom left corner, shattering the glass. I noticed the mall on the other side and leaped over with blood pouring down my arm and dripping on the floor. I managed to find a door, quickly inserted the key and practically jumped to the other side. I then continued for maybe another 20 times of opening the door, jumping through, closing, reopening, and then running through. In my mind, I was putting as many dimensions between me and that thing as possible. I'd say 20 times, but it could be more or less. I really can't remember. I wasn't thinking straight from the shock of what was happening and the pain in my arm. Once I stopped walking through the last door, I decided I had to try and get medical help for my arm, so started to walk through the tiny village that last door had brought me to. I managed to see a few people, so asked where the nearest hospital or doctor's office was, to which I was fortunate enough to be directed just a couple of streets away. Once I got to the doctor's office, I walked in, and by this time blood had soaked through my clothes, which was clearly visible. The receptionist quickly messaged the doctor, who came out and rushed me into a room with a hospital-looking bed and medical-looking equipment. I say medical-looking, as this was certainly not any equipment I recognized from my dimension, but regardless, I needed help, so thought nothing of it. The doctor started patching me up with this strange device that stitched the wounds together with nothing but little laser lights. I was amazed, but kept calm, as I needed this quite badly. Once all was done, the doctor asked me some basic questions, like my name and address and any medical history. I lied as best I could and was desperate to find a way out, as I still wanted to put more doors between me and the creature as possible. I asked the doctor if I could use the bathroom quick, to which he looked at me puzzled. I rephrased my question, and this time said I needed to pee, so could he point me to the direction of the toilet. The doctor, still confused from my question, stood up and asked if I had also hit my head. At this point, I was so confused but anxious to get away that I decided to run, and as I was running through the village, it was then, and only then after, I saw the doctor's face to my question that I noticed the village had no food shops anywhere. I stopped running after about 15 minutes and approached an elderly-looking woman and asked where I could get something to eat and drink. But to my amazement, the same look of confusion covered her face as it did the doctor. I tried to ask her how they survive without eating and how do they get energy. I wish I hadn't asked, because it was at this point the lady laughed and said, "Silly child, trying to confuse an old woman. I will show you how we get our energy." The woman then looked to the sky, and to my horror, her face opened to reveal a huge-looking flower. I gasped and looked on in disgust, but also curiosity. It was then I was looking at her that I noticed something in the background, something all too familiar, yet more terrifying than a strange flower lady. The creature that grabbed me was watching me and slowly walking towards us. I ran, but this creature kept coming and seemed to always keep up, yet always walking. I quickly opened a door and ran through it, but this dimension held horrors to which I will never recover, all while running from this creature. Little did I know how drastic my life would change after our second encounter.